Ibn Battuta, the most noted explorer of the medieval world, narrated a series of first-hand, comprehensive, and historically precious observations on lands to which he traveled over almost 30 years in the 14th century. This Moroccan traveler passed through countless communities, cities, and lands, and his observations, experiences, and encounters have much to tell about the world and its workings in medieval times. Guided and inspired by Ibn Battuta's footsteps, this podcast opens a portal into the world of the East for people who are curious about the past, hungry for the marvels of traveling, and contemplate the wonders of cities. Accompany us over our journeys into the distant, unfamiliar, and unknown.
I arrived at length at the city of Misr, Cairo, mother of cities and seat of the pharaoh, the tyrant, mistress of the broad provinces and fruitful lands, boundless in multitude of buildings, peerless in beauty and splendor, the meeting place of comer and goer, the stopping place of feeble and strong. Therein is what you will have of learned and simple, grave and gay, prudent and foolish, base and noble, of high estate and low estate, unknown and famous. She surges as the waves of the sea with her throngs of folk, and can scarce contain them for all the capacity of her situation and sustaining power. Her youth is ever new in spite of the length of days, and the star of the horoscope does not move from the mansion of fortune. Her conquering capital, Al-Qahira, has subdued the nations, and her kings have grasped the forelocks of both Arabs and non-Arabs. She has as her peculiar possession the majestic Nile, which dispenses her district from the need of entreating the distillation of the rain. Her territory is a month's journey for a hastening traveller, of generous soil and extending a friendly welcome to strangers.
Welcome to another episode of Oriental Journeys podcast, a podcast that is inspired by the travels of Ibn Battuta. My name is Ray Behboudi, and I will be the host of the program today. Ibn Battuta's extensive, vibrant observations and remarks from Cairo in 14th century vividly evoke the sense of the metropolis under the Mamluks' patronage. Sophisticated mosques, widespread Sufi hospices, numerous colleges, specialized hospitals, and bustling bazaars are just some of the features reported by Ibn Battuta that describe and unveil the charms of Cairo at the golden era of the Mamluks. In this episode, we walk through Cairo at the time of the Mamluks and reach across the ages to touch upon dazzling facets of the city as well as the Sultanate, with a guest whose heart is always in Cairo. Our special guest today is Doris Behrens-Abouseif, who is a Professor Emerita at SOAS, University of London, and previously Nasser Khalili Chair of Islamic Art and Archaeology at SOAS. Her many publications encompass a wide range of subjects within socio-cultural and art historical contexts, with a focus on Egypt and Syria from late antiquity and the early Islamic period to the 19th century, covering architecture, urbanism, material culture, and the decorative arts. Her heart always been in Cairo. She has written a widely admired book on the golden era of the city, Cairo of the Mamluks, a history of the architecture and its culture. Hello, Doris, and welcome to Oriental Journeys.
Hello, Ray. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We have just listened to a breathtaking description of Cairo reported by Ibn Battuta in 14th century. You're an academic from Alexandria, Egypt, and you have worked and lived in Cairo for so long. Imagine yourself in Cairo behind facades and awe-inspiring architectural lines of the Mamluks buildings. What feelings and thoughts run through you?
walking through medieval Cairo must have been an overwhelming experience. You don't need to ask me even. I can ask so many travelers. Ibn Battuta was one, of course, important one, who came himself from Arab Islamic culture. But if you look at the European traveler account on Cairo in the medieval period, it was an overwhelming city.
In what term when you say overwhelming city?
First of all, the size of it. It's the largest city in the world. It made the impression of being a huge city also because it was very crowded. Another point was the wealth of its monuments. Even after so many losses today, when you walk in the old city of Cairo, you still see so many buildings one next to each other, and you are still overwhelmed, although it is much has been lost. Then there is also another point which has always impressed eyewitnesses from outside is the wealth of the markets and the goods that were presented in the markets, which show that the city had connections worldwide. The goods that came from everywhere, the luxury, and in fact, it is interesting that another traveler who was a North African, Leo Africanus, when he came to Cairo just at the end of the Mamluk period, he visited Cairo during the Ottoman conquest, and he said what he saw in the markets he hasn't even seen in Italy at that time. And this was the period, the last days of Mamluk history, while the city was occupied and while the situation wasn't that positive at that time. It was just when the Mamluk Sultanate fell, and yet the markets were so rich and full of goods like nowhere else in the world. There's all of this, the cosmopolitan character, the size of the city, the wealth of the city, and most of all, very dense building activity that took place there, and the great monuments like very few other cities could display.
I should say that was an impressive start. All the aspects you mentioned, contributing to the overwhelmingness of Cairo, were just perfectly aligned with Ibn Battuta's observations in the 14th century.
For Ibn Battuta, of course, because he was an Arab Muslim scholar, there was also the one aspect which other European travelers did not experience is the scholarship. He could meet their scholars and could see and experience the academic activity and the religious patronage. He was also impressed by intellectual religious activities that were taking place in Cairo and in fact in Egypt at that time.
Being an Egyptian means you are by birth connected to Cairo and her charming stories. What caused you to focus your academic life to the era of the Mamluks?
It's difficult to tell, but the Cairo we see today, the old city of Cairo, I mean, this tiny part in the middle of the huge metropolis that Cairo is today, historic Cairo is mainly the Cairo that was bequeathed to us by the Mamluk. Officially, they call it the Fatimid city, Al-Qahira al-Fatimiyya, which is not, or the Fatimid founded Cairo. They gave the layout for it, but most of the architecture that is extant today from the past by far is Mamluk. So what you see today as old city is what has survived mainly from the Mamluk period. Then I would like you to mention I was influenced by Hussein Fawzi's book, which appeared in 1961 as Sindbad al-Misri, the Egyptian Sindbad. And this book was very successful then, and my father talked about it at home. And it's called the Egyptian Sindbad. The Sindbad serves over time. He travels across the historic periods of Egypt. And when he reaches the Mamluk period, or at the end of the book, he says, looking at Egyptian past and Egyptian history, the period that is closest to his heart, where he feels more familiar, where he feels more interested, is the Mamluk period. This is the way I feel too, and there is something true in that. And he says that in spite of all the bad things that were happening, the cruelty, the injustice, or whatever, it is still the period that is closer to him. This is because it was the period that created the Cairo, the medieval Cairo we know today, which is also the Cairo where Naguib Mahfouz put his earlier novels. So there is something fascinating about this old Cairo, which has been appealing to intellectuals. When I was educated in a way like many other Egyptians of my generation, wasn't educated to look at medieval Islamic period. I didn't know that. We didn't know that at home. But when one day after having done my studies, I went to Khan el-Khalili like tourists do, and suddenly I look at the monuments that were around me, and it was, sort of discovered them, like an outsider, in fact. I was overwhelmed by the wealth, by the imposing characters of this building, by the density of this building. And indeed, I came to this experience that I have to know about this period.
That's truly fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more why you found the legacy of Mamluks in Cairo appealing and attention worthy only when you return home from studying overseas? Why it was like a late discovery for you?
Yes, this was the problem, I think, perhaps of our education. My father was very interested in many cultural things. I mean, he loved poetry and literature. And I went to a French school, and it was not part of my education to learn or to get familiar with Islamic Egypt. But for us, the FAS was ancient Egypt. We went to the pyramids and we knew about Egyptian museum, but nobody took me to visit the old city of Cairo. This came after I studied Islamic history. This came after I looked at other foreigners who come to Egypt and who go and look at the monuments of Islamic Egypt. But at that time, it was not necessarily part of my education. So for me, it was a late discovery.
Under this section, I've got one final question to ask, and I'm very keen to find out the answer. Do you have any secret favorite corner in Cairo from the Mamluks era which you would like to spend time there?
Also, this question is not easy to answer, but I think that standing at the citadel and looking down at the city of Cairo, the citadel was the residence of the Sultan. So when I stand in the citadel and look down at Cairo with the mosque of Sultan Hassan, I get the panorama that Mamluk Sultan and the Mamluk rulers and the Mamluk patrons were looking at. And also, when you stand there, you can see the pyramids and you can see ruins of Heliopolis and other ancient Egyptian sites. Now I believe that the visible presence of this ancient Egyptian site may have had inspired the Mamluks to build something that hundreds and hundreds of years later people would still look at admire. This idea of memory, eternity. I think the ancient monuments, there were many more at that time also, and not so far from Cairo. So this may have given a kind also of dialogue with the past and then with posterity at the same time.
Mamluks literally means, in Arabic, owned. And the Mamluks have been called the dynasty of the slaves, a representation you have disagreed with. May I ask you then, who were the Mamluks and what was it that distinguished them from other slaves and dynasties?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question because it gives me again the opportunity of saying that I disagree. The Mamluks were neither a dynasty nor slaves. So, first of all, they were not a dynasty, simply although many sultans have always tried to have their sons as successors, the system was built upon a system of succession which was not hereditary. But I will come back to that. And they were not slaves, first of all, because the word Mamluk in Arabic doesn't mean slave at all. It means owned. And owned is a form of allegiance, a connection, but is not necessarily slavery. In Arabic, there's a clear distinction between Mamluk, means owned, and slave, which is abd or raqiq, which is the slave which people purchase in Africa and which commoners could buy, and everybody had, like it was in all medieval or in many pre-modern societies. The Mamluk was something special. The Mamluk, when owned, was recruited specially, and they were proud of it. They were purchased like slaves, but they were purchased for a very exalted task to serve in the military. And they were very proud of that one had to go very far to the end of the world from Cairo to the Kipchak steppes and recruit them there because one believed that they were fit and efficient and skillful in military tasks. And the moment they were acquired, they were trained militarily and educated to be a Muslim. And once they became a Muslim, you cannot enslave a Muslim. They were free. At the end, they were much freer than the local population who were born free. So the idea of Mamluk means that kind of allegiance, and they themselves, once they came to power, they recruited Mamluks like themselves. and they preferred this form of succession to the hereditary form. However, there was a whole dynasty, it is true, between the early period, the Qalawunid dynasties, between the 1280s and the 1380s for a whole century. Succession went from father to son. But even then, the new sultan had to be approved by a council of Mamluks and Emir who had a say. It did not go automatically. And the system was never, even when some sultans try to invest their children, their sons, as successors, it didn't really work on the long run. So it remained a system on non-hereditary basis. And this is not only for sultan and successor, but also for all the other high officials of emirs and high positions. So it was a lifetime tenure, and after that, the succession went to another appointed by appointment and by recruitment. Coming back to the initial issue, the word Mamluk does not mean slave. There are very clear words. Even the market for the slaves, where the slaves were sold, was a different market from that where the Mamluks were sold and bought slaves. And there's another thing. In Islamic law, the slave would never be allowed to carry weapons, whereas the Mamluks were recruited to carry weapons. And this system was not new or unique to Egypt then. It has been followed in other areas of the Muslim world. But anyway, I think it's very confusing to call them slaves, and I hope that one day one will stop using them about the Mamluks.
Yeah, I can see from your explanation that there is a clear distinction between the word owned Mamluk and the slaves app, both in Arabic and English. Ibn Battuta arrived at Al-Qahira, the original name for Cairo, when Egypt and many other neighboring territories were under Mamluks' patronage. How did the Mamluks come to power, and for how long did this era last?
Well, the Mamluks were recruited first in the end of the Ayyubid period by Sultan as-Salih Najmuddin, who was himself engaged in warfare with the Crusaders. This was a period of the Crusades. He recruited Mamluks to constitute a kind of elite corps in his army. And in fact, it was a very successful decision because thanks to the Mamluk, when the French king Louis IX came to Egypt in the crusade to conquer Egypt, the Mamluks were the ones who repelled him. They took him prisoner, captured him, and he had to be ransomed. This was the very first triumph at that time during the lifetime of Salah Medin. Then during the battle, he died, and they used this opportunity to take power. And they killed his son, it was one heir, and took power themselves. But short afterwards, the Mamluks were the first and only one to repel the Mongols and to prevent the Mongols at Ain Galut from coming, letting Egypt suffer the ordeal that Baghdad suffered. So the only ones who could have stand up to the Mongols and ultimately to the Crusaders by evicting them were the Mamluks. So they fulfilled the military expectations for which they were recruited. So and then they continued to rule. They adopted themselves the Mamluk recruitment system through an entire period until then the Sultanate fell in 1570. So between 1250 and 1570.
What territories were ruled under the Mamluk Sultanate, geographically, and how did this affect those who fell under this realm?
Egypt and what we call today Greater Syria, which is not just the Syria of today, but the whole Syria, Lebanon, Palestine were part of it, and a big chunk of what is today Turkey, of southeastern Turkey, was part of the Mamluk, quite a bit inside Anatolia. And they had a supremacy. They didn't call them the owner, the guardians of the holy cities in the Hejaz of Mecca and Medina. This was a privilege, and they called themselves the guardians of the holy cities, which, they dominated the cities, they sponsored them, they patronized them, they took care of the pilgrimage and the infrastructure of the pilgrimage. The Mamluks were content with the territory they had initially. They wanted to keep it. And in fact, they managed, in spite of all the threats and all the Ottoman advance, to keep the territory integral until it fell in 1517. Before that, they didn't lose it bit by bit. They kept it as much as they could, and suddenly it couldn't resist the overpower of Ottoman.
It's truly a thought-provoking fact. So Mamluks were keener to build up trade allies rather than conquering and colonizing the territories beyond their boundaries, unlike many other dynasties across the history indeed.
For example, in 1427, the Mamluks conquered Cyprus and subjugated Cyprus to vassals. So the Cypriots had to pay a yearly tribute to the Mamluk Sultanate. They had a military victory in Cyprus, but they kept a little small army there, a garrison there, but they never tried to colonize or to dominate or to occupy really the island. They preferred to keep it like this, perhaps for transit trade between them and Europe, and simply to be content with the financial advantage it brought rather than conquer. They could have made it part of the Egypt and Syria.
So it was very fascinating to know about the ruling arrangements or the ruling psychology of the Mamluks in terms of the territorial expansion. What prominent qualities made Mamluks trusted by the governing system?
There were two things. First of all, the fact that the military victories and their military presence, and the fact, as I said earlier, that they managed to evict the Crusaders from Muslim territory, and the fact that they managed to avoid the Mongol danger gave them a great deal, and so they were no longer threatened until the Ottomans arrived. This is the one point. After that, their religious patronage, the fact that charities, the many mosques, the many schools, all what they did in terms of defending Islam, serving the Muslim cause, and also by serving this, they provide a great deal of jobs. So many of the scholars had positions in this institution founded by the Mamluk. All the madrasas, the multitude of madrasas, the multitude of monasteries, the multitude of all these occupied the intellectuals. They gave jobs to scholars and to people, and these are were the ones also at the end who wrote history. And so at the end, in spite of critique, of course there was critique, but altogether the Mamluk were legitimized by general opinions. And also the fact that the wealth that was in Egypt and in fact in the Mamluk territory at that time, the Mamluks had, in spite of very heavy economic crisis in the 15th century, usually a rich territory with agriculture in Egypt and Syria, plus the very lucrative spice trade on which the Mamluks had monopoly. That is, any goods from Asia, from especially the spice trade that went to Europe, had to pass through Egypt territories, and the Mamluks had a monopoly and had the taxing rights on that. And this contributed considerably to the Mamluk state's wealth. This prosperity, although it became relative in the later period because of economic crisis and pressures and the trade routes being diverted now via the Portuguese away from the Mamluk territory and all of that, but this has created a situation that earned them the praise in general and the acceptance, in spite of them being foreigners, some of them being not good rulers, in spite of the fact that some of them didn't speak well Arabic, they were foreigners, and they were born as non-Muslims, all of that, they nevertheless, because they were approved of, or what they did was approved of altogether and in general, they maintained the legitimacy.
So we can conclude that Mamluks have earned their legitimacy over the time of both war and peace. At the time of war, by protecting Islamdom against the Mongols and Crusaders, and at the time of peace by provision of socio-economic stability, which lasted over centuries.
Yes, and usually the Sultan, Mamluk Sultan, was not isolated in his citadel away from the population. They were very much involved, the Sultan and his emirs and his court were very much involved in everyday life. They would even be involved in judging petty cases. They were there, they were often seen on the streets. They were really involved in the urban life of Cairo. In the Syrian cities, the governors did the same. They were not secluded outside within the citadels.
The Mamluks were brought to Egypt from dominantly Turk-resided areas, and they were trained and educated heavily to be able to accept these roles. Can you tell me a little bit more about their family life? How were they brought up, and how were ties developed within the groups, their patrons and the peers?
First of all, there were two different ethnic groups of Mamluk. In the first period, there were the ones of Turkic origin, whose main mother language was a kind of Turkish and who came from the Kipchak steppes. These were the Bahri Mamluks. Later on, we have what the Circassian period, which is since the 1380s, was ruled by Circassian sultans, and the Mamluks were recruited as among the Circassians of the Caucasus, so which is a different culture. Yet the lingua franca at the court and the language of the military remained the Turkish language. In the earlier period, apparently, when the Mamluks were recruited, they were very young, and this was the idea, to recruit them young so that they adapt easier to the new life. At the later period, apparently, it is said that they were less young and they were already almost adolescents. But anyway, the later period, Circassian and also all kind of other people were recruited whenever possible. The Mamluks very rarely, especially the sultans, married Egyptians. They married among themselves. They were married very often through diplomatic relationships. In the early period, the Mamluks, after the wars and after they have put the Mongols at their place, the Mamluks had an alliance or a kind of entente with the Mongols of Iran, and there was a peaceful relationship with diplomatic exchanges, cultural exchanges. The Mamluks were very fascinated by the Mongols, and they felt the early Mamluk, and they felt they were relatives of them. And many Mamluk sultans were married in the early period with Mongol princes, so other means that the successor were also they were half Mongols, and they were themselves very mixed. And there's all this academic debate how Mongol the Mamluks were. So the Mamluk court was full of Mongols, the Mamluk army was full of Mongol people who came as refugees, people who came because there were chances of war, people who came after the Entente, at the beginning also prisoners of war, after the first wars who were recruited to do works. So the Mongol presence was strong, and there were also others as well. The Mamluks generally did not marry among Egyptians or Syrians. So their children, as I say, every sultan somehow tried to put his son on the throne. And it, especially in the 14th century, it worked. We have seen from 1380 to the 1280 to the 1380s, we have a dynasty of Kalaun's son. In the 15th century, it didn't work. So usually the son would be there for a few months, and then the system didn't work that way. It didn't last. It didn't have an impact. So it was, in spite of the attempts, it was not hereditary. But still, they were the sons and the relative. They went in the city, they went to business, some of became scholars, and so on. So they went into urban life, ordinary urban life. Whereas the next emirs, the next sultans, were the new Mamluk recruits. And the sultans usually, and the rich emirs, usually provided for their children in their endowment. When they made a pious foundation, like a big mosque or so on, there were always money left and jobs left and quite a share left for the descendants. So they were taken care of.
You just mentioned that Mamluks were trained. What does training look like, and what subjects or types of subjects were part of this training or education?
They were training at the citadel, which was the center of power. There were the barracks there, and in the barracks they got a strict military education, and also at the same time education altogether in language, in politics. We have library in the barracks, and they were really educated all round in the barracks in the citadel. And then once they had passed the tests and they were ready, they were manumitted then, and they were no longer Mamluks in that sense. They were free, but then they joined whatever offices and positions they had to fulfill.
So it means that their education was too diverse. It was not only about the military skills, they were educated on lots of different things. It was like a proper education.
Basically, yes. First of all, they were educated to be Muslims. They were circumcised and educated to be Muslims, and they had to prove themselves or to prove that they are now Muslims, plus the military skills, of course. But there were also in the barracks, there was literary activities. There were people who were teaching language, teaching Arabic, texts on political sciences. So there was, of course, a wider education than just the plain military. Yes.
Many Mamluks sultans were not fluent speakers of Arabic. What was their native language, and how did they manage communication in the Arab dominant society?
Well, the first Mamluks who came were Turkic. They spoke a kind of Turkish language. They learned Arabic in the barracks as part of the education, but not all of them was fluent in speaking. Learning Arabic or learning the Quran and so on doesn't mean that they spoke, and between themselves they didn't speak Arabic. There were, however, among the Mamluk class many people who were educated, who spoke well Arabic. It depends, and especially among the emirs, those who occupy the position of secretary were educated. They had their libraries, they had the scholars, they patronized, they had their own circles of literary, and some of them also in the early period cultivated Turkish culture and had Turkish books, and so the Mamluk class was not necessarily a class of uneducated people. Yes, not all spoke well Arabic. In the later period, they came from the Caucasus. So what language they spoke is difficult to tell. There are many Caucasian languages. So Circassian language was one of them. But between themselves, with the Circassian Mamluk, they spoke Turkish. Because there are too many different dialects, I suppose, Turkish remained the language of the court for a while. But there were the occasions the sultans were interested in scholarship, and they had in their library Arabic books, and some of them even wrote poetry. But yes, they did not perfection the Arabic language in general at the court.
It is said that in Cairo there are 12,000 water carriers who transport water on camels, and 30,000 hirers of mules and donkeys, and that on its Nile there are 36,000 vessels belonging to the Sultan and his subjects, which sail upstream to Upper Egypt and downstream to Alexandria and Dumyat, laden with goods and commodities of all kinds. On the bank of the Nile, opposite Cairo, is the place known as Ar-Rawda, the garden, which is a pleasure park and promenade containing many beautiful gardens. The people of Cairo are fond of pleasure and amusement. I once witnessed a fete there which was held for a Malik al-Nasr's recovery from a fracture which he had suffered in his hand. All the merchants decorated their bazaars and had rich stuff, ornaments, and silken fabrics hung up in their shops for several days.
You have just listened to the observations of Ibn Battuta on Cairo, which gives us a great impression of the true prosperity held within this megacity of the medieval time. What political or commercial contexts brought that wealth to Cairo and make it that lucrative?
First of all, the geographic centrality of Cairo. In Cairo, it has been described as crossroad of embassies because ambassadors and envoys from the whole world came. Cairo was connected to Africa. Cairo was connected to India through the Red Sea. Cairo was connected to the Mediterranean. So geographically, Egypt, this is like the Suez Canal today. The transit, the link between the east and the west, between the north and the east, between Asia and Europe. And this is why this central location has always been very advantageous for Egypt, always. And the transit trade of spices, no luxury goods, no silks, no spices, no porcelain could come from Asia, from China, from India to Europe without passing through the Mamluks, who would then have their levy and raise their levy, and so they brought a great deal of posterity. And also, being a crossroads, the Mamluks controlled the holy cities of Islam, so it means the pilgrimage, that the places where Muslims from all over the world, including Ibn Battuta himself, it came from the west and came from the east to the pilgrimage of Mecca. So Mecca, which was the center of the encounter place of all Muslims every year from the world, belonged to Mamluk dominance, was part of Mamluk territory. And again, another centrality. Plus, also the Mamluks controlled the Christian side. All pilgrims, Christian pilgrims who had to go to Jerusalem, had to pass and had to be accepted by the Mamluk rulers to let them in. So the pilgrimage has always been a very issue of leverage of the Mamluks when dealing with Europeans, how to deal with them, because pilgrims had to pass through Mamluk territory and to come to Mamluk territory to visit the holy sites. This was a great deal of centrality Yeah, and allowed cosmopolitan, and allowed the Mamluk were able to import also things from Asia as much as they wanted, silks and spices and all luxury goods, at the same time from Europe, who were keen to buy the spices and also to sell their goods. So it has always been a crossroad for all kind of things, and also for scholars. Plus the intentionally patronage of religious institutions made to host students and scholars from all the world, from all the Arab world, from all the Muslim world, led indeed that these places were full of people coming from the east, from Iran, from beyond, and from the west, coming to study in Egypt and making use and profiting from the advantages of the scholarship, of the libraries, and so on. So it was a center of production. Mamluk was one of the strongest or the most powerful center of production of literature at that time, not only in the Muslim world, but probably even worldwide. The quantities of books produced, the quantity of books sold, the number of scholars working in Egypt and coming to learn in Cairo was tremendous. So there was a great deal of international level, commercially, culturally.
You painted this lucrative crossroad very vividly. So Mamluks were benefiting from the Egypt's exceptional location, which helped them building a prosperous economy over too many decades. Maybe here would be a good point. We wrap up our first round of our conversation on the fascinating Mamluks era and explore the cultural and social landscapes of Mamluks in the next episode. Thank you, Professor Doris, for joining us today, and thank you everyone for listening to another episode of Oriental Journeys. Don't forget, we will have another round of interesting conversation on this subject. All the passages from Ibn Battuta observations have been selected from the English translation, The Travels of Ibn Battuta, translated from Arabic to English by Hamilton Gibb and Charles Beckingham, published for the Hucklow Society in 5 volumes. You can follow Oriental Journeys on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also check out our website www.theorientaljourneys.com, which contains key information and codes on each episode. Our editor and creative consultant is Kate O'Connell. Aydogan Kars and Ashkan Bahrani are our content advisors from Monash University. Frank Joachim reads the passages from the Travels of Ibn Battuta. The music was composed by Ali Gogin and Tia Goodwin, cover art designer.